The sterile white walls of the courtroom seemed to close in on Serena, each tick of the mahogany clock a hammer blow against her sanity. Across the aisle, Vanessa, the woman who had shattered her world, sat with a serene, almost beatific smile, her hand resting possessively on Marcus's arm. He wouldn't meet Serena's gaze. He hadn't, not since she'd collapsed at the last hearing, the stress of their public evisceration too much for her and the baby she carried. Now, as Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, a crisp white envelope in his hand, Vanessa's smile widened. It was a victor's smile, a smile that said, "I have won." But smiles can shatter, and secrets like bones have a way of breaking when you least expect them to. The envelope was opened. A name was read. And in the silent, suffocating courtroom, a new truth was born, one that would either be the final nail in Serena's coffin or the unlikely key to her liberation. The scent of blooming jasmine, heavy and sweet, drifted through the open French doors of the conservatory, a fragrant promise of the coming summer. From her vantage point on the plush, cream-colored sofa, Serena watched her husband, Marcus, as he paced the length of their meticulously manicured lawn, his phone pressed to his ear. He was a portrait of masculine grace and power, his bespoke suit hugging the broad expanse of his shoulders, his dark hair catching the golden light of the late afternoon sun. To an outsider, they were the epitome of success, the golden couple whose lives were as flawless as the heirloom silver that gleamed in their dining room. But Serena knew the truth. She lived it every day. Their life wasn't a fairy tale. It was a gilded cage, and the bars were beginning to feel cold and unyielding against her skin. Their home, a sprawling testament to Marcus's ambition, was nestled in the heart of a wealthy, gated community, a place where secrets were currency and appearances were everything. Every corner of the house was a reflection of Marcus's taste, from the abstract art that adorned the walls to the minimalist furniture that screamed expensive discomfort. Serena had tried to inject her own personality into the space, a splash of color here, a sentimental trinket there, but her efforts were always met with a subtle, yet firm, resistance. "It disrupts the aesthetic, darling," he would say, his voice a silken caress that barely masked the steel beneath. And so Serena had learned to shrink herself, to become another one of his beautiful, well-placed possessions. She traced the rim of her porcelain teacup, the delicate floral pattern a stark contrast to the sterile perfection of the room. The tea had gone cold, just like the space between her and Marcus in their king-size bed. It hadn't always been this way. She remembered a time when their love was a vibrant, all-consuming flame, a time when his laughter was the sweetest music she had ever heard. They had met in college, two bright-eyed idealists with dreams as big as the city skyline. He was the ambitious law student with a quick wit and a disarming smile. She was the passionate art historian with a heart full of hope. He had promised her the world, and in his own way he had delivered. But the world he had given her was one of his own making, a world where she was an accessory to his success, not a partner in his life. The first cracks in their gilded cage had appeared subtly, hairline fractures that were easy to ignore. It started with the late nights at the office, the hushed phone calls he would take in the other room, the way his eyes would glaze over when she spoke of her own dreams and aspirations. She had tried to talk to him, to bridge the growing chasm between them, but her words were met with a wall of polite indifference. "I'm busy, Serena," he would say, his fingers flying across the keyboard of his laptop. "We can talk later." But later never came, and slowly, insidiously, a silence had fallen between them, a silence that was heavier and more suffocating than any argument. Her hand drifted to her belly, a gentle, protective gesture. The baby, their baby. She had hoped, with a desperation that bordered on delusion, that the news of her pregnancy would be the catalyst for change, the miracle that would mend their fractured marriage. When she had told him, his reaction had been less than she had hoped for. He had been pleased, of course, in the way a man is pleased when he acquires a new valuable asset, a son and heir. It would look good for his image, for the carefully constructed facade of the perfect family man he presented to the world. But there had been no joy in his eyes, no shared sense of wonder, no whispered promises of a future filled with love and laughter. There had only been a cool, calculating assessment of how this new development would fit into his meticulously planned life. A sudden, sharp laugh from the garden jolted her from her reverie. Marcus had finished his call and was now strolling toward the house, a triumphant smile gracing his lips. He slid the glass door open and stepped inside, bringing with him the scent of freshly cut grass and something else, something cloyingly sweet and unfamiliar. Perfume, not hers. The realization hit her with the force of a physical blow, a cold, sickening dread that coiled in the pit of her stomach. She had been a fool, a blind, naive fool. The late nights, the secret phone calls, the emotional distance, it all clicked into place with a horrifying clarity. He wasn't just emotionally distant, he was emotionally invested. Elsewhere. "Good news," he announced, his voice booming with a false bonhomie that set her teeth on edge. He loosened his tie and unbuttoned the top button of his shirt, a gesture that was meant to be casual, intimate. But to Serena, it felt like a performance, a carefully rehearsed act for an audience of one. "The Henderson deal is finally going through. This is big, Serena, really big." He poured himself a glass of whiskey from the crystal decanter on the sideboard, the amber liquid swirling in the glass like a captured sunset. He didn't offer her one. He hadn't, not since she had told him about the baby. It was another one of his subtle, controlling gestures, a reminder of her new diminished role in his life. She was no longer his wife, his partner, his equal. She was the mother of his child, a vessel for his legacy. She watched him, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. The man she had once loved, the man she had married, was a stranger to her. The laughter lines around his eyes, the curve of his smile, the sound of his voice. It was all a lie, a carefully constructed mask that concealed the cold, calculating heart of a man who was incapable of genuine love. And she, in her desperate, foolish hope, had allowed herself to be deceived. She had mistaken the gilded bars of her cage for the warm, protective embrace of a loving home. But now her eyes were open, and the world outside the cage, as terrifying as it was, seemed to hold a promise that was far more precious than all the gold in Marcus's world. The promise of freedom, the promise of a life where she could be more than just a beautiful, broken thing in a rich man's house, a life where she could be herself, a life where she and her baby could finally be free. The question was, did she have the strength to break the bars, to fly? Or would she remain a beautiful, tragic songbird trapped in a cage of her own making, her song slowly, irrevocably, dying in her throat? The answer, she knew, would determine not just her future, but the future of the new life that was growing inside of her. And for that life, she would find the strength. She had to. The whispers started subtly, like the rustling of leaves in a gentle breeze, easy to dismiss as a product of an overactive imagination. But soon they grew louder, more insistent, echoing in the cavernous, empty rooms of the house like a Greek chorus of her own impending doom. The whispers were in the receipts she found in his pockets, receipts for expensive dinners at restaurants he had never taken her to, for jewelry she would never wear. They were in the hushed, late-night phone calls that would abruptly end the moment she entered the room, in the way his eyes would dart away from hers, a flicker of guilt or perhaps annoyance in their depths. They were in the scent of a strange, cloyingly sweet perfume that clung to his clothes like a second skin, a scent that was a constant, suffocating reminder of his betrayal. Serena, once a woman who had moved through the world with an easy, confident grace, now found herself living in a state of hypervigilance, her senses on high alert, searching for clues, for irrefutable proof of the infidelity her heart already knew to be true. She became a detective in her own home, a ghost haunting the hallways of a life that was no longer hers. She would wait until he was in the shower, his booming off-key singing a jarring counterpoint to the frantic beating of her own heart, and then she would slip into his study, her hands trembling as she scrolled through his phone, her breath catching in her throat with every new discovery. The messages were a litany of her worst fears, a sordid digital tapestry of his deception. There were flirtatious texts, explicit photos, whispered promises of a future that did not include her. The other woman, a woman named Vanessa, was everything Serena was not. She was young, vibrant, ambitious, a rising star in his law firm. Her profile picture on social media showed a woman with a sharp, angular beauty, a predatory smile, and eyes that held a cold, calculating intelligence. She was a woman who knew what she wanted, and it was clear that what she wanted was Serena's life. The discovery, as devastating as it was, did not bring with it the righteous, cleansing anger she had expected. Instead, it brought a profound, bone-deep sadness, a grief for the man she had once loved, for the future they had planned together, for the family she had so desperately wanted to create. She saw him not as a monster, but as a man who was deeply, tragically flawed, a man who was so consumed by his own ambition, so desperate for external validation, that he was willing to sacrifice everything that truly mattered on the altar of his own ego. She thought of confronting him, of screaming and crying and throwing his betrayal in his face. But what would be the point? He would deny it, of course, with the smooth, practiced ease of a man who was an expert in the art of deception. He would gaslight her, make her feel like she was the crazy one, the irrational, hormonal, pregnant woman who was imagining things. And a small, cowardly part of her was afraid to face the truth, to hear the words that would shatter the last fragile remnants of her hope. So, she said nothing. She played the part of the dutiful, adoring wife, her smile a brittle, painted-on mask, her heart a frozen, desolate wasteland. She attended his work dinners, her hand resting on her swollen belly, a silent, poignant symbol of the family he was so callously destroying. She listened to him boast about his latest courtroom victory, the words a meaningless drone in her ears. She lay beside him in their cold, silent bed, the chasm between them wider than the ocean, and she prayed for the strength to do what she knew she had to do. The turning point came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon, a day as gray and bleak as her own soul. She was in the nursery, a room that was supposed to be a place of joy and anticipation, but now felt like a mausoleum for her dead dreams. The walls were painted a soft, sunshine yellow, a color she had chosen in a moment of optimistic delusion. A white, hand-carved crib stood in the center of the room, a beautiful, empty vessel waiting for a life that would be born into a broken home. She was folding a pile of tiny, impossibly soft baby clothes when she saw it, a small velvet box tucked away in the back of Marcus's closet, a place he thought she would never look. Her hands, slick with a nervous sweat, fumbled with the clasp. Inside, nestled on a bed of black satin, was a diamond necklace, a breathtakingly beautiful piece of jewelry that was far more extravagant than anything he had ever given her. It was not a gift for her. She knew that with a certainty that was as cold and hard as the diamonds themselves. It was a gift for Vanessa, a gift for the woman who had stolen her husband, her life, her future. And in that moment, something inside of her snapped. The sadness, the grief, the fear, it all coalesced into a single, white-hot point of rage. A rage that was pure, righteous, and liberating. She was done being the victim. She was done being the silent, long-suffering wife. She was done being a ghost in her own home. She was a woman, a mother, and she would be damned if she would let him destroy her. She placed the box back in the closet, her movements calm, deliberate. She walked out of the nursery, her head held high, a new, steely resolve in her eyes. The whispers in the walls had not driven her mad. They had awakened her. They had given her the clarity she needed to see the truth, not just about Marcus, but about herself. She was stronger than she had ever imagined, more resilient than she had ever believed, and she would not be broken. She would fight for herself, for her baby, and for the future that she deserved, a future that was free from the lies, the deceit, and the suffocating confines of the gilded cage. The whispers had become a war cry, and Serena, for the first time in a long time, was ready for battle. The confrontation, when it finally happened, was not the explosive, dramatic scene Serena had envisioned. There was no screaming, no throwing of plates, no tearful recriminations. Instead, it was a quiet, almost surgical, dismantling of their marriage, a calm, deliberate severing of the ties that had once bound them together. It happened on a crisp autumn evening, the air thick with the scent of wood smoke and dying leaves. Marcus had come home late, as he always did. his face flushed with the thrill of another successful conquest, another victory in the courtroom, another clandestine rendezvous with his mistress. He found her in the living room, surrounded by a sea of cardboard boxes and packing tape. She was sitting on the floor, her back against the sofa, a single flickering candle casting long, dancing shadows on the walls. She was not crying. Her eyes were clear, her expression serene, almost beatific. It was the calmness of a woman who had made a decision, a woman who had finally found peace in the midst of chaos. "What's all this?" he asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and annoyance. He gestured to the boxes, a frown creasing his handsome, well-tanned forehead. "Are we redecorating? You should have told me, Serena. We could have hired someone to do this." "I'm leaving you, Marcus," she said, her voice soft yet firm, each word a carefully chosen, perfectly aimed arrow. He laughed, a short, incredulous bark of a laugh. "Don't be ridiculous," he said, loosening his tie, a gesture that was meant to convey a casual, dismissive authority. "You're being hormonal. It's the pregnancy. Why don't you go upstairs and lie down? I'll have the maid clean this up in the morning." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and for the first time, she saw him not as her husband, not as the father of her child, but as a stranger, a handsome, charming, utterly soulless stranger. "I know about Vanessa," she said, her voice as cold and sharp as a shard of glass. The color drained from his face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. The mask of charming indifference slipped, revealing the panicked, cornered animal beneath. "I don't know what you're talking about," he stammered, his eyes darting around the room, as if searching for an escape route. "Don't lie to me, Marcus," she said, her voice rising in volume, laced with a contempt that was as bitter as gall. "Not anymore. I know everything. The dinners, the gifts, the weekends away. I know it all." She stood up then, her movements slow, deliberate, her pregnant belly a proud, defiant shield. "I even know about the necklace," she said, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "The one you bought for her last week. The one you hid in the back of your closet. Did you really think I was that stupid? That I wouldn't find out?" He stared at her, his mouth opening and closing like a fish out of water. He was a master of manipulation, a virtuoso of deceit, but he had no defense against the simple, unadorned truth. He was caught, exposed, stripped bare of his lies and his carefully constructed facade. "It's not what you think," he finally managed to say, his voice a hoarse, desperate plea. "It was a mistake. It meant nothing." "It meant everything," she countered, her voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "It meant that you have no respect for me, for our marriage, for the child I am carrying. It meant that you are a coward, a liar, and a cheat. And I will not spend one more minute of my life with a man like that." The front door opened then, and Vanessa walked in, a breezy, confident smile on her face. She was a vision of youthful, predatory beauty, her red dress a stark, jarring splash of color in the muted tones of the room. She stopped short when she saw Serena, her smile faltering for a fraction of a second before being replaced by a look of cool, calculated amusement. "Well, well, well," she said, her voice a low, throaty purr. "Look what we have here, a little domestic drama. How very quaint." She sauntered into the room, her hips swaying with a practiced, provocative grace. She ran a proprietary hand over Marcus's arm, her red lacquered nails a stark contrast to the pale, fine wool of his suit. "Don't worry, darling," she said, her eyes fixed on Serena, a triumphant, mocking glint in their depths. "The crazy, hormonal, pregnant wife will be gone soon, and then we can finally be together." It was the we that did it, the casual, possessive we that spoke of a shared future, a future that had been built on the ruins of Serena's life. The last fragile thread of her composure snapped. The rage she had been suppressing for so long, the rage she had held in check with a superhuman effort of will, finally erupted, a volcanic, unstoppable force. She flew at Vanessa, her hands outstretched, her nails curved into claws. She was a lioness protecting her cub, a force of nature in her righteous, untamed fury. Marcus, his face a mask of shocked disbelief, tried to intervene, but she pushed him away with a strength she didn't know she possessed. She and Vanessa fell to the floor in a tangle of flailing limbs and flying hair. a maelstrom of rage and betrayal. It was ugly, primal, and deeply, profoundly satisfying. For the first time in a long time, Serena was not the victim. She was not the silent, long-suffering wife. She was a warrior, a fighter, a woman who was taking back her life, her power, her dignity. The fight ended as quickly as it had begun. Marcus, his face a mixture of fear and disgust, pulled them apart. Vanessa, her perfect, predatory smile now replaced by a look of shocked, indignant fury, scrambled to her feet, her red dress torn, a long, angry scratch on her cheek. "You're crazy," she shrieked, her voice a high, hysterical screech. "You're a crazy psycho bitch." "Get out," Serena said, her voice low, menacing, each word a drop of ice in the superheated air of the room. "Get out of my house, both of you." Marcus, for once in his life, seemed to be at a loss for words. He looked from Serena's face, a mask of cold, implacable fury, to Vanessa's, a mess of tear-streaked makeup and righteous indignation. He had underestimated his wife. He had mistaken her quiet, gentle nature for weakness. He had thought she would crumble, that she would be a pathetic, sniveling mess. He had been wrong. He made his choice then. He took Vanessa's arm, his touch gentle, solicitous. "Come on," he said, his voice soft, soothing. "Let's go. She's not worth it." They walked out of the house, out of her life, without a backward glance. Serena stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by the wreckage of her marriage, the silence of the empty house pressing in on her from all sides. She should have felt devastated, heartbroken, alone. But she didn't. She felt liberated. She felt a sense of peace, a sense of clarity, a sense of hope. The unveiling had been brutal, ugly, and painful, but it had also been necessary. It had been the catalyst for her transformation, the crucible in which she had been forged into a new, stronger, more resilient version of herself. The gilded cage was no more. The door was open, and she was finally, gloriously free. The courtroom was a theater of hushed whispers and thinly veiled animosity, a sterile, impersonal space where the messy, painful details of their shattered marriage would be laid bare for all to see. Serena sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands clasped tightly in her lap, her knuckles white. Her lawyer, a kind, competent woman named Ms. Rowan, sat beside her, a reassuring presence in the face of the impending storm. Across the aisle, Marcus and Vanessa sat at the defendant's table, a united front of smug, self-righteous indignation. Marcus, in his ridiculously expensive suit, looked every inch the powerful, successful lawyer he was. Vanessa, her face a mask of cool, calculated composure, looked like a predator who was about to enjoy a particularly satisfying meal. The divorce proceedings were a brutal public evisceration of Serena's life, a systematic dismantling of her character, her worth, her sanity. Marcus's lawyer, a slick, silver-tongued shark named Mr. Huxley, painted her as an unstable, vindictive, gold-digging shrew who was using her pregnancy as a weapon to extort money from his client. He twisted her grief into hysteria, her anger into insanity, her pain into a pathetic, desperate ploy for sympathy. Serena listened to the litany of lies, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She wanted to scream, to shout, to defend herself against the vicious, baseless accusations. But Ms. Rowan had warned her to remain silent, to maintain her composure, to not give them the satisfaction of seeing her break. So she sat there, a silent, stoic statue, her face a mask of calm, serene indifference, while inside a storm of rage and despair was raging. Marcus, the man who had once promised to love and protect her, sat there and said nothing. He watched as his lawyer tore her to shreds, his face a mask of cool, detached amusement. He was enjoying this. He was reveling in her pain, her humiliation, her suffering. He was a man who was so consumed by his own ego, so devoid of empathy, that he was willing to destroy the mother of his child in a public forum just to save a few dollars in the divorce settlement. The days bled into weeks, a blur of depositions, motions, and court appearances. Serena's life became a living nightmare, a relentless assault on her senses, her emotions, her spirit. The stress was taking its toll. She couldn't eat. She couldn't sleep. She couldn't escape the constant, gnawing anxiety that was her constant companion. The baby, her precious, innocent, unborn child, was the only thing that kept her going. The only reason she got out of bed in the morning, the only reason she continued to fight. The custody battle was the most brutal part of the proceedings. Marcus, in a move that was as cruel as it was calculated, was suing for sole custody of the child. He claimed that Serena was an unfit mother, that her emotional instability made her a danger to the baby. He brought in a parade of so-called experts, a team of psychologists and child development specialists who had been paid handsomely to testify against her. They twisted her words, her actions, her emotions into a damning indictment of her character, her sanity, her fitness as a mother. Serena felt like she was drowning, suffocating under the weight of the lies, the deceit, the injustice of it all. She was a good person, a kind person, a loving person. She would be a wonderful mother. But in the cold, impersonal, and deeply flawed world of the family court system, the truth seemed to be an irrelevant, inconvenient detail. The media, drawn to the scandal like vultures to a carcass, had a field day. The story of the wealthy, powerful lawyer, his beautiful, scorned wife, and his young, ambitious mistress was a juicy, irresistible piece of gossip. They painted Serena as a tragic, pathetic figure, a woman who had been cast aside for a younger, more beautiful model. They printed unflattering pictures of her, her face pale and drawn, her eyes red-rimmed and swollen from crying. They dissected her life, her marriage, her character, with a callous, voyeuristic glee. Vanessa, meanwhile, was portrayed as the sympathetic, misunderstood heroine of the story. She gave interviews to glossy magazines, her face a mask of sweet, innocent sincerity. She spoke of her deep, abiding love for Marcus, of their unbreakable bond, of their plans for a future together. She even had the audacity to speak about the baby, about her excitement at the prospect of becoming a stepmother, of her desire to co-parent with Serena in a modern, blended family. The hypocrisy was breathtaking. The injustice was staggering. The pain was unbearable. Serena felt like she was living in a funhouse hall of mirrors, a distorted, grotesque reflection of her own life. The world had gone mad, and she was the only sane person left. But even in the darkest of moments, there were glimmers of hope. Ms. Rowan, a fierce, tireless advocate for justice, was a beacon of light in the darkness. She fought for Serena with a passion, a tenacity, and a skill that was awe-inspiring. She cross-examined Marcus's witnesses with a surgical precision, exposing their lies, their biases, their bought and paid for testimony. She presented a compelling, powerful case for Serena's fitness as a mother, for her right to raise her own child. And then there was the DNA test. Ms. Rowan, in a move of strategic brilliance, had filed a motion to compel a prenatal paternity test. Marcus, in his arrogance, had not contested it. He was so sure of himself, so confident in his own power and invincibility, that he had walked right into her trap. The results of that test, Miss Rowan had assured her, would be the key to their victory, the final, irrefutable proof of Marcus's treachery, the nail in the coffin of his lies. As the day of the final hearing approached, a sense of nervous anticipation filled the air. The courtroom was packed, a sea of reporters, spectators, and legal vultures, all eager to witness the final act of this sordid public drama. Serena, her belly a taut, heavy drum, walked into the courtroom with her head held high, a new steely resolve in her eyes. She was no longer the victim. She was no longer the broken, pathetic creature the world had made her out to be. She was a mother, a warrior, a survivor, and she was ready for the final battle. The courtroom was no longer a place of fear and humiliation. It was a battlefield, and she was determined to emerge victorious. The air in the courtroom was thick with a palpable, suffocating tension, a silent, crackling energy that promised an impending storm. It was the final day of the hearing, the day Judge Whitmore would deliver his ruling, the day Serena's fate and the fate of her unborn child would be decided. She sat at the plaintiff's table, her hands resting on her swollen belly, a gesture that was both protective and defiant. She could feel the baby moving inside of her, a gentle, fluttering reassurance that she was not alone in this fight. Across the aisle, Vanessa and Marcus sat, as they always did, a portrait of smug, self-satisfied superiority. Vanessa, in a dress that was a shade of white too pure, too innocent for a woman of her character, had a serene, almost beatific smile on her face. It was the smile of a woman who was confident of her victory, a woman who was savoring the sweet taste of her rival's impending defeat. Marcus, his face a mask of cool, impassive indifference, looked bored, as if the proceedings were a tedious, inconvenient distraction from his more important, more profitable pursuits. Mr. Huxley, Marcus's lawyer, was in the middle of his closing argument, his voice a smooth, silken river of lies and half-truths. He paced back and forth in front of Judge Whitmore's bench, a theatrical, self-important peacock in a ridiculously expensive suit. He was painting Serena, once again, as a hysterical, unstable, vindictive woman who was unfit to be a mother. He spoke of her erratic behavior, her emotional outbursts, her history of mental instability. He was a master of insinuation, a virtuoso of character assassination, a man who could twist the truth into a grotesque, unrecognizable caricature of itself. Serena tried to tune him out, to focus on the rhythmic, steady beat of her own heart, on the gentle, reassuring movements of the baby inside of her. But his words, like a slow, insidious poison, seeped into her consciousness, chipping away at her composure, her resolve, her sanity. The room started to feel hot, suffocating, the walls closing in on her, the faces of the spectators a blur of gaping, curious mouths and cold, judgmental eyes. Her heart began to race, a frantic, panicked bird trapped in the cage of her ribs. A cold sweat broke out on her forehead, her hands slick and clammy. The edges of her vision began to blur, the world dissolving into a swirling, vertiginous vortex of light and shadow. She could hear a loud buzzing sound in her ears, a sound that was getting louder, more insistent, drowning out the sound of Huxley's voice, the sound of her own ragged, shallow breaths. She tried to stand up to get some air, to escape the suffocating confines of the courtroom. But her legs wouldn't obey her, her body a leaden, unresponsive weight. She felt a wave of nausea, a dizzying, disorienting sensation that threatened to overwhelm her. She reached for Ms. Rowan's arm, her fingers a weak, desperate clutch. "I don't feel well," she whispered, her voice a thin, reedy thread of sound. And then, the world went black. She was vaguely aware of the sound of a collective gasp from the courtroom, of Ms. Rowan's panicked voice calling her name, of the frantic, shuffling sounds of people rushing to her aid. But it was all happening at a great distance, a muffled, dreamlike sequence of events that had nothing to do with her. She was floating, drifting, in a silent, peaceful, and blessedly dark void. When she came to, she was lying on a leather couch in Judge Whitmore's chambers, a cool, damp cloth on her forehead. Ms. Rowan was hovering over her, her face a mask of concern. Judge Whitmore, a stern, gray-haired man with kind, compassionate eyes, was standing by the window, his back to her. "What happened?" Serena asked, her voice a hoarse, croaking whisper. "You fainted," Miss Rowan said, her voice soft, gentle. "The stress of the proceedings. It was too much for you." Judge Whitmore turned around then, his expression a mixture of sympathy and professional detachment. "I've suspended the proceedings for the day," he said, his voice a low, rumbling baritone. "I've also called for a paramedic. They should be here any minute." Serena struggled to sit up, a wave of dizziness washing over her. "No," she said, her voice stronger now, more insistent. "I'm fine. I want to continue. I want to hear the ruling." Judge Whitmore looked at her, a flicker of admiration in his eyes. "Are you sure?" he asked. "You've been through a lot. No one would blame you if you wanted to rest." "I'm sure," she said, her voice ringing with a new steely resolve. The fainting, as terrifying as it had been, had not weakened her. It had strengthened her. It had reminded her of what she was fighting for, of the precious, innocent life that was depending on her. She would not be intimidated. She would not be defeated. She would see this through to the end. She walked back into the courtroom, her head held high, her steps slow but steady. A hush fell over the room as she took her seat at the plaintiff's table. Across the aisle, Vanessa's serene, beatific smile had been replaced by a look of smug, triumphant satisfaction. She had seen Serena's collapse as a sign of weakness, a final, pathetic admission of defeat. She leaned over and whispered something in Marcus's ear, a triumphant, conspiratorial whisper that sent a fresh wave of rage through Serena's veins. Judge Whitmore entered the courtroom and took his seat at the bench. He cleared his throat. The sound a loud, authoritative crack in the silent, expectant air of the room. He picked up a single, white envelope that was lying on his desk, an envelope that held the results of the prenatal paternity test, an envelope that held the key to Serena's future. "Before I deliver my ruling," he said, his voice a low, sonorous boom that filled the courtroom, "there is one final piece of evidence that I would like to enter into the record." He tore open the envelope, his movements slow, deliberate, each rustle of the paper a hammer blow against Serena's sanity. He unfolded the single sheet of paper inside, his eyes scanning the contents, his expression unreadable. Vanessa's smile widened, a shark's smile, a predator's smile. She was so sure of her victory, so confident in her power over Marcus, so certain that the world was about to be delivered into her perfectly manicured hands. She squeezed Marcus's arm, a possessive, triumphant gesture. She was already celebrating her victory, already savoring the sweet, intoxicating taste of her rival's utter and complete annihilation. She had won. She had everything she had ever wanted, or so she thought. But smiles like glass can shatter, and the truth, like a tidal wave, was about to come crashing down, washing away the lies, the deceit, and the carefully constructed facade of her perfect, stolen life. The silence in the courtroom was a living, breathing entity, a heavy, suffocating blanket of anticipation that pressed in on Serena from all sides. Every eye was on Judge Whitmore, his face a stony, unreadable mask as he stared at the single sheet of paper in his hand. The paper that held the truth. The paper that would either be the final, crushing blow to Serena's already shattered life, or the unlikely, miraculous instrument of her salvation. Vanessa's smile was a thing of grotesque, triumphant beauty, a work of art in the medium of human cruelty. She was a queen on her throne, surveying the wreckage of her vanquished foe, savoring the moment of her absolute, unequivocal victory. She leaned in close to Marcus, her lips brushing against his ear, a whispered, venomous, sweet nothing that was meant for Serena's ears, a final twisting of the knife in her already bleeding heart. Judge Whitmore cleared his throat, the sound a loud, jarring crack in the silent, expectant air of the room. He looked up from the paper, his eyes sweeping over the courtroom, his gaze finally resting on Marcus. There was something in his eyes that Serena had not seen before, a look of cold, undisguised contempt. "Mr. Huxley," Judge Whitmore said, his voice a low, rumbling thunder that sent a shiver down Serena's spine. "In your closing argument, you painted a picture of my client, Mrs. Donovan, as a woman who is, and I quote, unstable, vindictive, and mentally unbalanced. You claim that she was using her pregnancy as a weapon, a tool of extortion, a means to a financial end. You argued that she was an unfit mother, a danger to her own child." He paused, letting his words hang in the air, each one a drop of acid in the superheated atmosphere of the room. "Well, Mr. Huxley," he continued, his voice dripping with a sarcasm that was as sharp as a razor's edge, "it seems that you and your client have been operating under a slight misapprehension." He picked up the paper, his movements slow, deliberate, theatrical. "I have here the results of the prenatal paternity test that was ordered by this court," he announced, his voice booming through the courtroom, each word a hammer blow against the fragile, carefully constructed edifice of Marcus's lies. "The test was administered by a neutral, third-party lab, and the results are, to say the least, illuminating." He looked directly at Marcus then, his eyes two chips of ice in his stony, impassive face. "Mr. Donovan," he said, his voice as cold and unforgiving as a winter's wind, "according to this test, the probability of you being the father of Mrs. Donovan's child is 0%. The words, so simple, so devastating, so utterly unexpected, hung in the air for a moment, a stunned, incredulous silence, before the full cataclysmic force of their meaning hit the courtroom like a physical blow. A collective gasp rippled through the room, a sound like the rushing of a mighty wind. Reporters scrambled for their notepads, their faces a mixture of shocked disbelief and professional, predatory glee. This was a story for the ages, a twist so dramatic, so improbable, that it belonged in the pages of a dime store novel, not in the hallowed, respectable halls of a family court. Vanessa's smile, that beautiful, triumphant, cruel smile, faltered, wavered, and then shattered, like a pane of glass that has been struck by a stone. The color drained from her face, leaving behind a pasty, sickly pallor. Her mouth opened, but no sound came out. She stared at Marcus, her eyes wide with a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and a dawning, sickening horror. Marcus, for his part, looked as if he had been poleaxed. His face, usually so handsome, so confident, so infuriatingly smug, was a mask of shocked, slack-jawed disbelief. He stared at Judge Whitmore, his eyes wide, his mouth agape, his carefully constructed world crumbling around him in a pile of dust and ashes. "That's not possible," he stammered, his voice a hoarse, croaking whisper. "It's a lie. The test is wrong. She cheated on me." Judge Whitmore's lip curled in a sneer of undisguised contempt. "Are you sure about that, Mr. Donovan?" he asked, his voice a low, menacing purr. "Because I have another document here that I think you might find interesting." He reached into a folder on his desk and pulled out another sheet of paper. "This is a copy of a medical report from a fertility clinic," he announced, his voice ringing with the clarity of a bell. "A report that details a procedure you underwent 2 years ago, a vasectomy." The second bombshell hit the courtroom with the force of a physical explosion. The whispers turned into a roar, a tidal wave of shocked, incredulous noise that threatened to overwhelm the room. Vanessa, her face a mask of horrified, disgusted disbelief, recoiled from Marcus as if he were a leper, a diseased, unclean thing. The man she had sacrificed everything for, the man she had built her future around, was a fraud, a liar, a sterile, impotent shell of a man. Serena, for her part, was in a state of shock, a dazed, dreamlike disbelief. She had known, of course, that the baby was not Marcus's. The father was a man from her past, a kind, gentle, and long-lost love she had reconnected with in a moment of desperate, lonely weakness. A single, beautiful, and deeply regretted mistake. She had kept the secret locked away in the deepest, darkest corner of her heart, a source of shame, guilt, and a constant, gnawing fear. She had been prepared to live with the lie, to raise the child as Marcus's, to protect her baby from the stigma, the scandal, the pain of the truth. But now the truth was out, and it was not the devastating, life-destroying blow she had feared. It was a weapon, a shield, a key. Judge Whitmore banged his gavel, the sharp, authoritative crack a thunderclap that finally restored a semblance of order to the chaotic, frenzied courtroom. "Silence!" he roared, his voice a force of nature that commanded respect, obedience, and a terrified, cowed submission. "Silence in the court!" He looked at Marcus, his eyes blazing with a righteous, unholy fury. "Mr. Donovan," he said, his voice a low, menacing growl, "you have committed perjury. You have lied under oath. You have attempted to defraud this court. You have maliciously and intentionally inflicted emotional distress on the mother of a child that is not even yours. You are a disgrace to your profession, a disgrace to this court, and a disgrace to the human race." He paused, letting his words sink in, each one a nail in the coffin of Marcus's reputation, his career, his life. "I am finding you in contempt of court," he announced, his voice a sentence of death, "and I am recommending that the state bar review your license to practice law. As for the divorce settlement," he continued, a cruel, satisfied smile playing on his lips, "I am awarding Mrs. Donovan the house, the car, and 75% of your assets. I am also granting her a restraining order against you, effective immediately. And as for custody of the child," he said, his voice softening, his gaze resting on Serena with a look of kind, compassionate sympathy. "Well, Mr. Donovan, I think it's safe to say that that is no longer an issue." The gavel fell, a final, definitive, and deeply, profoundly satisfying thud. The case was closed. The battle was over. The war was won. Serena, the broken, pathetic, and scorned woman, had emerged from the ashes of her shattered life, not as a victim, but as a victor, a survivor, a phoenix rising from the flames. The revelation had not destroyed her. It had liberated her. It had given her a new life, a new future, a new hope. And as she walked out of the courtroom, her head held high, a small, triumphant smile on her lips, she knew with a certainty that was as bright and clear as the morning sun that the best was yet to come. The aftermath of the courtroom revelation was a whirlwind of flashing cameras, shouted questions, and the kind of intense, voyeuristic public scrutiny that Serena had once feared more than death itself. But now, as she navigated the gauntlet of reporters that had gathered on the courthouse steps, she felt a strange, almost surreal sense of calm. The truth, as painful and complicated as it was, had set her free. She was no longer a prisoner of Marcus's lies, no longer a victim of his cruelty, no longer a character in the sordid, tragic drama he had created. She was the author of her own story now, and she was determined to write a happy ending. Ms. Rowan, her face wreathed in a triumphant, satisfied smile, shielded her from the worst of the media frenzy, her arm a protective, reassuring presence around Serena's shoulders. "Don't say a word," she whispered, her voice a low, urgent murmur in Serena's ear. "Let them speculate. Let them write their sensational, ridiculous stories. We've won. That's all that matters." And she was right. They had won. Serena had her freedom, her financial security, and most importantly, her child. The future, which had once seemed so bleak, so terrifying, so utterly hopeless, was now a blank canvas, a world of infinite possibilities. The drive home was a blur of rain-streaked windows and the rhythmic, hypnotic thump of the windshield wipers. Serena stared out at the city, at the endless stream of cars, at the anonymous, hurrying figures on the sidewalks, and she felt a profound sense of detachment, as if she were watching a movie of someone else's life. It was all too much to process, too much to absorb, too much to feel. So she felt nothing, a blessed, merciful, and deeply necessary numbness. When she arrived back at the house that was now hers, the silence was deafening. The rooms once filled with the ghosts of a dead marriage now felt empty, cavernous, and strangely peaceful. She walked from room to room, her footsteps echoing on the polished hardwood floors, and she saw the space not as a gilded cage, but as a sanctuary, a place where she could heal, a place where she could start over, a place where she and her baby could build a new life, a life that was free from the shadows of the past. She went to the nursery, the room that had once been a source of such pain, such despair, and she felt a surge of love so fierce, so powerful, that it took her breath away. This was her purpose now. This was her reason for being. This tiny, innocent, and deeply loved life that was growing inside of her. She would be a good mother. She would be the best mother she could possibly be, and she would protect her child from the cruelty, the ugliness, and the injustice of the world. The days that followed were a quiet, gentle, and deeply healing period of reflection and renewal. Serena disconnected from the world. She turned off her phone, she ignored the news, she shut out the noise of the scandal that was raging around her. She focused on herself, on her health, on her baby. She ate well, she slept deeply, she took long, leisurely walks in the garden, the scent of the rain-washed earth a balm to her weary soul. She thought about the baby's father, a man named Ethan, a kind, gentle, and deeply soulful artist she had loved and lost in her youth. Their brief, unexpected reunion had been a moment of weakness, a desperate, foolish attempt to recapture a long-lost dream. But it had also been a moment of genuine human connection, a moment of warmth and tenderness in the cold, sterile desert of her marriage to Marcus. She knew she had to tell him about the baby. He deserved to know. He had a right to be a part of his child's life. But she wasn't ready. Not yet. She needed time. Time to heal. Time to find her footing. Time to become the woman, the mother she was meant to be. As for Marcus and Vanessa, their downfall was swift, spectacular, and deeply, profoundly satisfying. The story of the vasectomy, of Marcus's lies, of his public, humiliating evisceration, was a media sensation. He became a pariah, a laughingstock, a cautionary tale of hubris, arrogance, and the kind of spectacular, self-inflicted wound that the public loves to see. His law firm fired him, his clients abandoned him, his friends and colleagues ostracized him. He was a ruined man, a king who had been toppled from his throne, a god who had been exposed as a mere and deeply flawed mortal. Vanessa, the beautiful, ambitious, and utterly ruthless homewrecker, did not fare much better. The story of her affair with a sterile, impotent, and now disgraced lawyer made her a target of public ridicule and scorn. The law firm she worked for, the same one that had once employed Marcus, fired her as well, citing a morality clause in her contract. Her dreams of a life of wealth, power, and social status had turned to dust. She was a woman who had bet everything on the wrong horse, a predator who had been outsmarted, outmaneuvered, and ultimately destroyed by her own ambition. Serena took no joy in their suffering. She felt a strange, detached kind of pity for them, a sadness for the broken, empty, and deeply unhappy people they were. They were trapped in a prison of their own making, a prison of greed, ambition, and a desperate, insatiable need for external validation. They were a reminder of the life she had escaped, of the person she could have become, of the darkness that she had, by the grace of God, and the miraculous intervention of a simple, unassuming DNA test managed to leave behind. The aftermath was not an ending. It was a beginning. It was a new chapter in her life, a chapter that was filled with the promise of hope, of healing, of a second chance at happiness. The storm had passed, the wreckage had been cleared, and in the quiet, peaceful, and blessedly sun-drenched aftermath, Serena and her baby were finally and gloriously free. The first rays of the morning sun streamed through the nursery window, painting the soft yellow walls in a warm golden light. Serena sat in the rocking chair, her baby girl, a tiny, perfect, and utterly miraculous creature named Grace, asleep in her arms. She was 3 weeks old, a bundle of soft, warm, and sweetly scented innocence. Her tiny chest rose and fell in a steady, rhythmic, and deeply reassuring rhythm. Her rosebud lips curved in a small, contented smile. Serena looked down at her daughter's face, a face that was a beautiful, perfect, and deeply moving blend of her own features and those of the man she had once loved. The man who was now a ghost from a past that seemed to belong to another lifetime. She had told him, of course. She had called Ethan the day after the final court hearing, her heart a frantic, panicked bird in her chest. He had been shocked, of course, but also happy, genuinely, deeply, and movingly happy. He had dropped everything and flown to her, his face a mask of concern, his eyes full of a love that was as deep, as true, and as constant as the northern star. He was here now, in her house, in her life, a quiet, gentle, and deeply reassuring presence. He had been her rock, her anchor, her safe harbor in the storm. He had held her when she had cried. He had listened when she had raged. He had celebrated when she had won. He had been there for the birth of their daughter, his hand in hers, his voice a low, soothing murmur in her ear. He had cut the umbilical cord. He had held Grace in his arms, his eyes shining with a love so fierce, so powerful, that it had taken Serena's breath away. They were not a couple, not in the traditional sense. It was too soon for that, too complicated, too raw. They were two people who were bound together by a shared love for a child, a shared history, and a shared hope for a future that was still unwritten. They were taking it one day at a time, one step at a time, one breath at a time. And for the first time in a long, long time, Serena felt a sense of peace, a sense of hope, a sense of a future that was filled with the promise of a love that was real, a love that was true, a love that was unconditional. She thought of Marcus, a man who was now a distant, pathetic, and deeply irrelevant memory. He had tried to contact her, of course, a string of desperate, rambling, and deeply self-pitying emails and voicemails. He had begged for her forgiveness. He had pleaded for a second chance. He had tried to manipulate her with a cloying, insincere, and utterly transparent display of remorse. She had not responded. She had deleted the messages. She had blocked his number. She had erased him from her life as thoroughly, as completely, and as mercilessly as he had tried to erase her. Vanessa, too, had disappeared from the face of the earth, a disgraced, forgotten, and deeply cautionary footnote in the story of Marcus's spectacular and deeply satisfying downfall. Serena occasionally felt a flicker of pity for her, a sadness for the young, ambitious, and deeply misguided woman she had been. But the pity was fleeting, a passing shadow in the bright, sun-drenched landscape of her new and deeply fulfilling life. The world outside the nursery window was waking up, the city stirring to life, the sounds of traffic, of birdsong, of a world that was moving on, a world that was filled with the promise of a new day, a new beginning, a new dawn. Serena looked down at her daughter, at the beautiful, perfect, and deeply loved symbol of her own resilience, her own strength, her own survival. She had been through the fire, she had been to hell and back, she had been broken, battered, and bruised, but she had not been defeated. She had emerged from the ashes of her shattered life, not as a victim, but as a victor, a survivor, a mother. She leaned down and kissed her daughter's forehead, a soft, gentle, and deeply loving gesture. "I love you," she whispered, her voice thick with an emotion that was too deep, too profound, too sacred for words. "I will always love you, and I will always, always protect you." The baby stirred in her sleep, a small, contented sigh escaping her lips. Serena smiled, a genuine, heartfelt, and deeply happy smile. The gilded cage was a distant, fading memory. The whispers in the walls were silenced. The courtroom was a stage for a play that had long since ended. The storm had passed, and in its wake, a new and beautiful world had been born. A world of love, of hope, of second chances. A world where a mother and her daughter could finally and gloriously be free. As she rocked her baby, a question, soft and insistent as a whisper, formed in her mind. A question for the silent, watching world beyond her window. What would you have done if you were in her shoes, faced with the same lies, the same betrayals, the same impossible choices? What path would you have taken? Would you have fought or would you have fled? Would you have chosen forgiveness or would you have chosen revenge? Would you have crumbled under the weight of the world or would you have found the strength to rise from the ashes, to build a new life, to embrace the promise of a new dawn? The answer, she knew, was a story in itself, a story that was as unique, as complicated, and as deeply, profoundly human as her own.